So, speaking of cultural artifacts, we move on to our media picks for the month. And I'm picking something which I definitely didn't particularly enjoy, and you're picking something which you,
Enjoyed, but with caveats.
with caveats, but both of it, all of it, comes from the broader classical world. And so, my media pick of the month actually is for bad reasons. Unfortunately, I'm highlighting Troy Fall of a City. Now, Mrs. Soup and I love a good epic, and Mrs. Soup in her first life before she trained for the job that she's in now was actually initially a classicist, and so she is quite familiar with the story that Homer wrote about the Trojan War, Paris stealing Helen, and the 10-year conflict that came out of that. And so we sat down thinking, oh, this is interesting. Actually, I hadn't heard about any of the build up to this, again, probably because I've been distracted for a month. Uh, we turned it on and figured we'd give it a go. And actually, Mrs. Soup's parents were here as well. They were staying with us over those couple of days. And all of us were just aghast at how incredibly unimpressive, unepic this TV series has turned out to be. And it looks like we're not alone. The broad consensus online appears to be that Troy Fall of a City is essentially not as big as it could or should have been.
I wonder if what we're seeing is a reaction to what happens when you try to dramatise one of the core texts, one of the core stories of Western popular culture.
Hmm.
Even if you aren't a classicist, most people have heard of the Wooden Horse of Troy. Even if they don't know the backstory, even if they don't know that the dispute came out of a Paris Prince of Troy being asked to judge a beauty contest between three goddesses.
Mm-hmm.
It's a an absolute. It is. You talk about epic. It's one of those great epics that transcends. Naturally, it's the quest. It's the clash of cultures. It's and so yes, it ought to be an equally massive presentation.
Well, but also, this is the literature that shapes our understanding of what a hero is. It
Indeed.
shapes are from a literary, but also literally.
Yeah, yeah.
It shapes how we view international conflicts. It shapes epic story.
Mm.
It arguably things like the ambition of things like the Edda wouldn't exist were it not for these sort of stories being
This
told in
is
this way.
this is
And also right down to the word Odyssey. We people, even if they've never heard of any of this stuff,
yeah.
we use these words because they are so important.
The
And this,
the concept of the Trojan horse.
yeah,
Uh, but I think what we're dealing with here is, to put it in its media context, as archaeologists will all about context. We're dealing with the BBC, which has a reputation for producing high quality historical drama, Wolf Hall being one of the most recent.
hmm
And joining forces in a co-production with Netflix, which is one of the new content providers, which is putting massive amounts of money into its own branded programming.
hmm hmm
This is an example of the new media landscape trying to create a big show that is going to be sold worldwide, which is going to be streamed as well as broadcast, and which will fill the same kind of space in people's schedules, because the idea of a broadcast schedule, as in that everybody sat down at 9 o'clock to watch the same thing, doesn't exist anymore.
No.
So so they're looking for something that will have the same kind of audience penetration as the big example at the moment is Game of Thrones, and Game of Thrones is about to broadcast its ninth and last series. So they're going for the epic, quasi-historical, lots of sex and violence, big budget, high production value show. I think.
This I think this is arguably, possibly what's happened here. This is possibly one of the problems. Is that, I mean, we often talk about in our media picks this tension between a historical setting and narrative and looking for the next Game of Thrones. You very much understand the desire and the need to drive forward to find that next big property. I am a little bit more skeptical about how people go about doing that. And in this instance, what we have then is possibly the very definition of a formulaic attempt to reproduce the success of Game of Thrones. This idea that it's just about violence and sex. Put that on the screen and people will love it. And actually that's reflected in the publicity. Lots of the interviews surrounding this TV programme with the director, with the cast, with the crew, have been emphasising body politics, sex and violence. And that's okay, that is in the story. It's an ancient Greek story. Of course sex and violence and grim sacrifices are going to be there. But that's not what makes it an epic. That's not what makes it the Iliad and ultimately the story of Troy.
But okay, but look, I think what people have to remember as well is we've only had 2 episodes broadcast so far. In television terms, in narrative terms, in writing terms, the first episode is always the most difficult to bring off because you have to introduce characters that many of the audience may not be familiar with. You have to introduce backstory. You have to make people care about these characters. You have to get people used to the visual and oral language that you're going to use through the rest of the series.
And in this instance, the visual language, but the thing that should have been making the impact, really just doesn't. It's drab, it's small scale, the colours are washed out, and actually, you talk about the first episode is the most difficult to do. What about the person who told, or the people who told this story over in banqueting halls throughout millennia? That moment, you have to grab the audience from the beginning. Listen well, put down your drinks and listen about this character. You introduce some fantastic, interesting characters right at the beginning. You have a fascinating scenario, and then out of that comes your epic. It shouldn't be that hard to do, especially with the Iliad.
But at which point, I will tell you that the famous story, the oft-quoted story about the little boy who was asked if he preferred TV or radio, and he said radio because the pictures are better. When you've got Homer or whoever Homer or whatever Homer was reciting the Iliad in the banqueting hall of a Greek city, the king of a Greek city-state, the pictures are going on in the heads of the audience. Here, you've taken the decision to put this on our mass medium of the moment, which is a visual medium, and therefore you have to provide the pictures within the constraints of your narrative structure and your budget. In terms of the drabness, it's been set. It's filmed in like a lot of modern series are in South Africa, and the landscape of South Africa has some key colours. Production designer, you're responding to certain tones and colours and images in landscape that you're shooting.
I'm not talking about production design necessarily. I'm also talking about the cinematography. It just didn't have. For example, here you go. The opening lines of the Iliad: "Sing, goddess, Achilles' rage, black and murderous, that cost the Greeks incalculable pain, pitched countless souls of heroes into Hades dark, and left their bodies to rot as feasts for dogs and birds, as Zeus's will was done. Begin with the clash between Agamemnon, the Greek warlord, and the godlike Achilles." Now, that you want to know what happens next, and the first episode of Troy did not do that. It just didn't. I don't care what happens next. Partly because I already know what happens next, but also partly because the way the story was told, it's just uninteresting. And I think that's the biggest sin that an adaptation of the story of Troy could commit. And frankly, I mean, even Game of Thrones at this point looks more interesting to me.
So the point is, it took Game of Thrones 2 or 3 series to really take off as a big cultural event.
One paragraph and you're in.
Yeah. But it makes you want to know what happens next. It makes you want to read what happens next. Television doesn't work like that. Cinema doesn't work like that.
Of course, yes.
I mean, there's the old Cecil B. DeMille joke about how do you make a good film: start with an earthquake and build up to the climax. But
the Bond films, for example, that's an excellent example of that. You start out with something that just grabs you. But anyway.
Yeah. I agree. I'll agree with some of that. It maybe hasn't been as compelling as it could have been. I'm prepared to give it a little more benefit of the doubt, a little more time. And I think it's been done with some of it's been done with a certain sort of flair and integrity. There's a really nice Greek warship.
Okay.
I really like that.
Oh, really? I like the Greek
Yeah,
warship. Oh, all right.
a Greek galley,
Okay,
and
cool.
we're getting some interesting interactions. Don't forget, some of the big characters really haven't had a chance to establish themselves yet. One of the big conflict in the Iliad is between noble Hector and petulant narcissistic Achilles,
Mm-hmm.
and who comes out on top?
Mm-hmm.
It's the good guy loses and gets dragged around the city behind a chariot.
Mm-hmm.
There's some big stuff still to come. If they can't bring that off, then yeah, there's a problem. But I'm prepared to give it a bit more benefit of the doubt, I think, than you are.
Okay. I've just got better things to do with my time, unfortunately.
But
Anyway,
the whole point about being able to stream it is that when you've got a bit of downtime, you can just look at another episode, or you can sit down with a bottle of wine and just watch the box set.
yeah, or you can get rid of that mildew in the shower. I mean, that needs my attention. So, moving on to your media pick of the month. So yesterday we had to abandon Andy's media pick because, frankly, I think the snow was affecting the internet connection. It was fairly bad weather, and it was just terrible for the internet. And you might have seen hints of that throughout the rest or the other segments of this podcast, but it just got unbearable. We were going crazy, weren't we, Andy?
Yeah, more crazy than normal.
Exactly.
It was bizarre. Well, I mean, we've been doing this for over a year now, and I've not known a recording session like it for stutters, pixels, freezes, you name it.
I mean, it was more like looking at a painting than a video, to be honest. It was just terrible.
And a not particularly good piece of modern art. Actually.
Exactly. A terrible impressionistic, wannabe cubist. Now, actually, you've gone a little bit cubist already, so we better crack on with this media segment.
Take two.
And yes, take
of
two.
many.
Yeah, of many. And actually, I'm going to just keep this little bit in, I think. So yes. So, what is your media pick of the month, Andy?
As we alluded to when we began this recording centuries ago. I've gone down the classical route in the same way that you have with Troy, Fall of a City, except that being a Romanist, of course, I've gone for the Roman end of the classical spectrum. And I'm choosing Mary Beard's latest documentary for the BBC, which is called Caesar Revealed, which aired in the UK this week.
And this is presumably about Julius Caesar.
That's right. I mean, Mary Beard is probably our leading media academic, certainly in the humanities. Mm-hmm. And she's Professor of Archaeology at Cambridge, has a very strong reputation, and a very strong reputation actually as fronting accessible but well thought out documentaries about her particular field of expertise. And in fact, she's one of the three co-presenters of the new BBC series Civilizations, which I suspect we're going to be talking about next month.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, you heard it here first. But on this occasion, it was a BBC Two documentary. So it's the BBC's slightly more cerebral channel, if you like, but not quite as high end as BBC Four.
No,
so
not Channel 4. That's something else entirely.
No. So it's aiming at a slightly more general audience. If you to use a term that might be pejorative in some people's eyes, a slightly more popular format. But basically, it's Mary Beard's take on the life of Julius Caesar and why the life of Julius Caesar is still relevant to us today in the 21st century.
Okay, but in what ways do you think connections were made then?
Well, that's the interesting part of the programme, because it was Mary Beard is she is very much in control of her material. She knows her subject backwards.
Mm-hmm.
And also, she's a very engaging media personality. She can produce a piece to camera, and explain something complicated in an accessible way without really having to break a sweat. And not many people can do that.
Well, she is, despite being such a learned and venerable figure. She has a very approachable demeanour. And even though she is incredibly rigorous in her research, she
Yeah.
through her, actually, as many of the best archaeology and classics professors are, they have a natural enthusiasm for their subject, and this just comes across in her everyday appearance, in her everyday demeanour. This is just what she likes to do. She's not
Yeah.
putting on a show for you. Yeah.
Precisely. But and therein lies my problem with this particular program, because
Hmm.
actually, in many respects, rather than playing to those strengths, it actually undercut them by being sort of the production undercut them on occasions, not all the way through. I think I need to stress I actually enjoyed the program,
Hmm. Hmm.
but there were occasions when, if you like, the point that was being made was being actually undercut by the visual illustration that was meant to reinforce it, because it was distracting.
Okay.
I'll give you a case in point. One of the most one of the points in the program was that Caesar's life is very relevant to modern politics,
Mm.
and in talking about the origin of the political slogan, the political soundbite, Mary Beard references the famous message to the Senate, Bene Vidi Vici, the "I came, I saw, I conquered," as a prototype soundbite. Take back control. I came, I saw, I took control.
Education,
Um,
education, education.
Absolutely.
1997.
It's even the same format.
Yes, we
Education.
can.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's a strong enough point in itself, delivered very cleanly, very effective. But rather than just shoot it, in front of some modern political posters, or with a modern party political broadcast playing in the background, muted, or even just some in front of some street art in a Roman subway, which is where the particular sequence appears to have been shot. She had to actually, as well as quoting the phrase, take a red aerosol and appear to spray it on the wall of this Roman subway, with a tricksy camera shot that made it appear that the camera was on the wall looking through as the slogan was being sprayed. It was just over egged.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is, you asked me to watch this show, and sorry, that sounds almost accusatory. You made me watch it. No,
I think people should be reassured that when we talk about this stuff, we have actually seen the programs.
yeah, no, and it is good. It was good. It was. I was very familiar with the subject matter. So was the lovely Mrs. Soup as well, as a former classicist in her case.
Yeah.
So we sort of weren't surprised by anything in the program, but I know what you mean by the way that things were presented. So, for example, for me, and actually I messaged you more or less when I started watching the show. The whole thing starts out with strangely, Mary Beard in an operating theatre. She's got the green gown on.
Scrubs.
They're all in scrubs, yeah, and it's they're there to witness a cesarean section, a C-section, and. The problem is I'm not quite sure what the purpose of that was. On the one hand, you could argue that maybe they were trying to make the point this is where the name Caesar literally touches so many people's lives today. In another instance, you could possibly say that she was trying to say this is how Caesar's life kind of got its beginning, but that wasn't really expressed. According to the myth, he was C-sectioned, hence being eponymous in that sense. But it was just a clumsy thing. It felt more like a producer had kind of said, "Do you know what would be really cool if we just put you in a theatre and you could just talk about the C-section?" It didn't seem to serve a purpose that helped the especially the very beginning of the case, as it were. This little lecture that she was giving.
I think you've nailed it. I think there was an element, and I can't think why, given her track record, that she wasn't being trusted by the producer and the director to actually produce the goods. Now, I mean, maybe that they were all her ideas. I don't know about the background of production. If they were her ideas, occasionally...
Well, then the question has to come down to the editing team, then, in terms of the production.
Somebody should have said, actually, Professor Beard, that's not... We don't actually need to do that.
Which does not work. Yeah, it just didn't work. It just didn't work. Yeah, but and then a couple of other things. I mean, for example, there was a very firm connection drawn between Caesar putting his face on coins and the coinage that we have in our pockets. In terms of we have, for example, have the Queen on our coins. Now, what was interesting is that the implication there was that Caesar was the first person to do that. He definitely wasn't. You know, people, for example,
absolutely, and in fact, my son, who's studying classics at the moment, picked that up straight away. He was really cross about it. He said, but just poor research,
yeah, absolutely wasn't.
Misleading.
But I think what she was again getting at, but failed to actually the program failed to explain, was that Caesar, and in particular Julius, Caesar Augustus, they learn the lesson that carefully managing your appearance on the coinage is important. So just as with the Queen, in fact, all the portraits are about 5 to 10 years out of date. Yes. So you always look a little bit younger than you are on your coins. And in that sense, there was a message there. And actually, this could have been a much stronger connection with the modern era in terms of brand management. That's something that Caesar certainly helped Augustus to learn the lesson of. But that wasn't picked up on, and instead we got this slightly clumsy hint that Julius Caesar was the first person to put his face on a coin, and that's just not the case at all.
And then at various other occasions in the programme, we had sort of walk-on parts for people who were apparently casual tourists in the Roman Forum or whatever, who were
or outside the Parthenon, yeah.
Absolutely, and who were suddenly part of the scene, and you know, it just, as I say, it just seemed over-conceptualized and over-directed. It was, you know, back in the day, people, you know, the TV directors would trust. A.J.P. Taylor is the famous instance where the late Professor A.J.P. Taylor would produce a 20-minute or half-hour lecture to camera with no visuals, just him speaking without notes, because he had absolutely mastered his material and was a very compelling lecturer. And it held your attention. Nowadays, directors don't trust the people fronting documentaries to do that.
No.
And it's a question. The talk it suggests is that, you know, television's a visual medium, therefore it has to have visuals to accompany the words, which is fair enough. You know, it's perfectly possible to do that extremely well, and it's done extremely well on many occasions.
But it's also done into extreme. I mean, for example, on the news, they can't go without saying almost anything without having often a fairly naff stock bit of footage, you know, like DNA spiraling, for example, or, you know, people walking on a pavement to illustrate, you know, like stuff which actually in some respects is cluttering the message.
Oh, well, it's like, I mean, Private Eye make fun of it with the and over to section which they run from time to time, where they you have we see it on the news that you cut to a correspondent in the pouring rain outside Parliament or something, basically tell the studio that nothing's happened.
Do you know? Actually, I can top that. Yesterday, during the red weather warning in the southeast, you had this guy in Truro for the BBC saying, "Now the police are telling everyone to stay indoors. Do not do what I'm doing outside. Stay in." Of course, he didn't go so far as to actually say, "Don't do what I'm doing." But my point is, yeah, they felt the need to have someone in the snow to confirm that it was snowing, to tell you that you shouldn't be out in the snow.
Yeah. Having presumably filled in the umpteen pages of a BBC health and safety risk assessment.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, it's an issue, and I think anybody who's ever been involved in TV programs, and I've been lucky enough to work on a number of TV programs now, on both sides of the camera. And in fact, just last week I was doing some work on a forthcoming documentary, which was to do with archive film research. And I had a very interesting conversation while we were doing that with the producer of the program and the overall producer of the series, where we were working out and talking through whether a particular film sequence was valid historically because it illustrated what was actually being talked about in the moment in the particular package of the documentary we were looking at, or whether it was valid as as a general illustration of the subject without being specific, and did it matter that it wasn't specific, or actually on a couple of occasions that piece of footage can't be used because it represents something completely different, and somebody sitting within an anorak will write you a letter in green ink or flame you on Twitter for having made a huge mistake.
Well, so actually the XY-16 bomber was not used in attacking those sorts of areas.
Exactly that. Yes, it had the wrong type. The one you showed had the wrong type of engine.
Oh, I see. Yes,
that's how detailed it can get sometimes.
That engine had you could put the petrol in directly from inside the fuselage instead of out.
Yeah.
Now, just to round this segment off, is it worthwhile acknowledging and I suppose asking briefly the question: are we in fact being that guy? When it comes to Mary Beard, are we in fact being the guy who goes, well actually, or not? Because I don't think we are. My interest is clarity of message, of purpose, and ultimately the effectiveness the efficacy of what's being presented. I mean, do you think maybe we're being too nitpicky, or do you think actually that in this instance there's a reason why it made us a bit uncomfortable?
No, like as I said, overall I enjoyed the program. I thought it was as you'd expect from somebody as experienced as Mary Beard is. It was well expressed. There was a clear narrative line. There was a clear analytical line, and the theses that she was putting up were perfectly valid ones.
Well, and also actually, so it was also at times actually it was well bounded, and by that I mean there was an elegance in so much as she didn't feel the need to talk about, and then of course came Augustus. She sort of said the people who came after him. She didn't. It was focused in that sense. It was she could have gone off on she could have talked about Marius and all the horrible things that happened before Caesar. She didn't. It was focused. It was elegant in that sense, certainly.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's very interesting you said that, actually, because I was reading a preview of the Civilizations, the new series that she's involved in, yesterday, and it quoted the then presenter of that series, the late Kenneth Clark, who introduced I think it was the first program, in fact, of the original series back in 1969, by saying, Ruskin said. And the writer of the article made the point that at that time, the BBC producers would assume that the audience watching that programme would know who Ruskin was. And nowadays they say, as Ruskin, the Victorian art critic, said.
Yeah.
And
yet she didn't do that. She didn't talk about how Sulla set a precedent for a tyrant, and none of that was necessary. So in that sense, it was focused. It's just,
Yeah, as I say, my only problem with it really, and we'll leave aside the issue of the coins, which may that may have been a slight misstep, a little bit of extra explanation might have been required there. But overall, it was just a little bit, not consistently, but at times just over-directed, over-conceptualized. The screen was too busy, and it actually distracted you from the point, which is you've got a very erudite woman sharing her knowledge in a popular but accessible but smart way. Exactly what TV documentaries should be doing. And it was just being undercut by, as I say, an overly fussy production at times.
Yeah, okay. But nonetheless, well worth giving a go.
Absolutely.
If you have access to iPlayer.
If you have access to BBC iPlayer, it's available, I think, for the next 3 weeks from the time of recording, and I suspect it's going to turn up on other networks like BBC World and so on.
Yeah, okay. Cool. Well, we've made it. We managed it. We got all the way through. We got like 95% of the way through this at one point yesterday.
It's a bit like Cooking Wenceslas delivering the firewood and whatever, isn't it? You know, we've
Yep.
made it through the snow
Yep.
and
Yep.
delivered another watching brief.
Oh, thank goodness for that. Well, hopefully next month's watching brief won't be so snowy. Although, you've turned into a painting now. You keep on. I think we should just say bye-bye. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you, Andy, once again, as ever, for your time. And until next month, bye-bye.
Bye bye, Mark.